The following presentation is brought to you by Rise to the Rescue, supporting Joe Glean, Prospective Delegate for Virginia's 44th House District.
A number of weeks ago, while I was out gathering signatures, I engaged in a brief conversation with a gentleman who identified himself as an active member of the local Republican chapter. At the time, their candidate had not yet been formally announced, but I was told that the selection had been made. "Oh yeah, he came and spoke to our group a few weeks ago," the gentleman said, "and we agreed to support his campaign." Intrigued by this information, I asked, "How does he stand on life issues?" The answer I received was this: "Well, he didn't talk about it specifically, but our chapter is devoutly pro-life, and we agreed to support his nomination. We've made it our practice to only offer our support to nominees who are pro-life. And so yeah, he's definitely pro-life." A number of weeks later, the candidate he was referring to, John Barsa, officially announced his candidacy. And for those who might have missed it, there's a presentation posted on my YouTube channel entitled "Northern Virginia Tea Party Candidate Blasts the Republican Nomination of John Barsa." In that presentation, I spoke of the red flag that ought to pop up in our hearts and minds whenever a politician or an aspiring politician postures himself in a way that indicates an intention to neglect the God-given preeminence of our moral sovereignty. This was in reference to Barsa's campaign announcement, and specifically in relation to the fact that he didn't even bother to say anything about the unconscionable moral exploitations that have been implemented by the state and which continue to jeopardize the future of our Commonwealth. Following my review of his campaign announcement, dated August 15th, I was able to obtain a copy of his campaign flyer on August 23rd. And again, nothing is said in relation to the moral challenges that we face. Earlier this past week, we're now in mid-September, Barsa unveiled his campaign website. "Once again, I see no sign or shadow of any moral courage whatsoever." And so even if it were true that John Barsa were pro-life, more on that in a moment, it's pretty safe to say that he intends to adhere to the political posturing of both major parties by neglecting the primary duty of all statesmen to defend and protect our God-given rights. Consequently, my campaign has exposed the stark contrast that exists between principled republicanism, which my candidacy proudly represents, and what I would refer to as log cabin neo-secular republicanism, which John Barsa's candidacy sadly represents. For example, if I weren't on the ballot, Barsa would no doubt have remained completely silent on the issue of life throughout this entire campaign. And good people like the man I spoke with while I was out gathering signatures might have remained caught up in the flawed logic of presuming that since Barsa was endorsed by the Republicans, he must therefore be a strong advocate of life, family, marriage, and religious freedom. We now know, however, that he advocates none of these things. Instead, he has convinced himself that local residents want their elected officials to focus on bread-and-butter concerns, as this article puts it, such as the economy, jobs, and transportation problems. It sounds to me like he's been watching a little too much CNN. By the way, this information comes from a profile piece about John Barsa that the Mount Vernon Patch published a few days ago. As he continues his door-to-door campaign, Barsa says it's not the hot-button issues such as abortion and same-sex marriage that voters are talking to him about. The article quotes Barsa as saying, "I think people want a truce on social issues." Quite frankly, when I read comments like this, and then see that John Barsa has already collected well over $11,000 in political contributions, I can't help but wonder how many of those donations came from people who thought they were contributing money to a pro-life candidate. Another thought that crossed my mind as I read those fantastic comments is that Barsa must not be paying very close attention when it comes to world events. After all, it was just last month that the United Kingdom Prime Minister David Cameron spoke candidly about the recent rioting in Great Britain. He was quoted as saying, "Social problems that have been festering for decades have exploded in our faces." He said, "We have been too unwilling for too long to talk about what is right and wrong, from marriage to welfare." He spoke of children without fathers, crime without punishment, and rights without responsibilities, pointing out that the worst aspects of human nature had been tolerated, indulged, and even fortified through government-mandated incentive programs. He says, by a state and its agencies that in parts have become literally demoralized. All of these very same legislative themes, things that were once unheard of in the United States, are beginning to dominate state legislatures across the nation. This is the aim of politicians like Adam Ebbin, Scott Sourville, and others who continue to advocate for the statewide indoctrination of social progressivism. These people never stop. They never rest. They continually look for new ways to chip away at our God-given rights. What's really at stake is the general abduction of our inalienable rights by those in power. And for those who think that politicians like John Barsa are going to somehow save our local communities from these menacing political movements by simply pretending that none of it really matters, or by doling out empty reassurances meant to compensate for their overtures of inaction and neglect, well, I think these folks would be fooling themselves if they actually believed it to be true. What we really ought to be doing is looking for the type of leadership that demonstrates a moral competence and a clear understanding of the core issues. We need to fill the Virginia General Assembly with individuals who have the courage not just to speak the truth, but also to stand for those principles of truth. Not just to advocate equal justice, but also to demand it at all costs. And when we find leaders who possess these respectable characteristics, these candidates are the ones who we ought to be supporting at the ballot box. I would encourage voters to do a bit of soul searching over the next few weeks. Republicans, you don't have to settle for politicians like John Barsa. And Democrats, you don't have to settle for politicians like Scott Sourville. If you're someone who values life, liberty, marriage, and family, I want to have voters like you by my side on Election Day. I would encourage you to reject both of these phony choices by casting your vote for the uncompromising level of principled conservatism that is required when filling any post or position of responsibility under the Constitution. On November 8th, 2011, there will be 3 possible ways to underscore your dissatisfaction with the political parties. One way is to skip the polls entirely. The second way is to vote none of the above by submitting a blank ballot. But the only effective way is to cast a vote that symbolizes the basic desire that we all have, that we remain a people willing to come together for the sake of restoring America's founding principles. And so I hope to see you at the polls as we courageously endeavor to stand up to the political parties and exert our moral influence.